you know what I like to do?
I like to look at some baseball cards.
And now, here's Johnny.
Welcome back. Thanks for joining me. This is going to be a video response for my man James, Elite Hunters. And he wants us to say why we love vintage. My love affair for vintage started when I started collecting. I had a babysitter give me some cards that were just a few years older than the ones I had, and I was hooked. What I love about vintage the most is the history. I love the history of the game, the history of the cards themselves, and baseball cards have a long, rich history, a long, rich international history. Cards were made in Japan, they were made in Europe, they were made in Canada, they were made in Venezuela, they were made in El Salvador. Cards were made all over the world, and they celebrated at the time, which was America's pastime and clearly the most popular game in America. And players like Babe Ruth would get worldwide notoriety, and many other countries featured him and other players like him, if there are any other players like him, on cards. Those players that became known worldwide. You know, like Sadaharu Oh here in the United States, everybody knew who he was, but they probably couldn't name another Japanese player. So Babe Ruth was like that all over the world. Man, there are so many things that I like about vintage, I don't even know where to begin. Like I said, I love vintage for the history of the game, the history of America. I love vintage for the different sizes and cool looking cards. I love vintage for the variety. I love vintage because it celebrates the greatest players the game has ever known. I love vintage because you can get Canadian versions of American issued cards. I love vintage because they had test issues. I love vintage because no two vintage cards are the same. No two are the same. I love vintage because they didn't come out of the packs 10s. I love vintage because you don't have to have a 10 for a vintage card to look fantastic. I love vintage because they came on all kind of different products. I like vintage because when a young player was coming up, he could put the bat boy in his place and Topps would take the picture and not know the difference. You didn't have these rookies putting on a shirt, taking it off and cutting it up and putting it in a card, even though they only wore it for 2 seconds. I like vintage because they had variations, but they weren't meant to be collected as variations. I like vintage because they're organically rare. I like vintage for the wrappers. I like vintage for the artwork. I like vintage for the uncut sheets. I love vintage because the cards are nearly endless. Most of all, I love vintage probably because it's nostalgic for me. That's what I have for you. Thanks, James, for the contest, and thanks for hanging out with me.
I like the T206 and the T205. Those old cards make me feel alive. I like the play balls and the Cracker Jack cards. I like the Goudies and the Diamond Stars cards. I like them graded. I like them raw. I like them sharp. I like them with a flaw. I like the W's and the R's. I like the E's and the T's. I like the new too, but man, I love the vintage. Man, I love the vintage. Man, I love the vintage. Man, I love the vintage.
Man, I love that vintage. Man, I love that vintage.
I can't go wrong with a Tattoo Orbit or DeLong. I like Ruth, Wagner, and Cobb. I'll say it again. I like them raw. I like them with a flaw. I like them minty. You don't want them? Give me. When I see old cards, I get giddy. I like the new, but man, I love the vintage. Man, I love the vintage. Mama, man, I love the vintage. Mama, man, I love the vintage. It's never balana, mama. It's never balana, mama.
Man, I love that vintage. Man, I love that vintage.
Mama, man, I love that vintage. It's never balana, mama. It's never balana, mama.